and then I'll just try and see. Now people can start coming in. So thanks everyone for joining and welcome, but we'll still wait a couple of minutes. Yeah, I can see, I'll just want to open my little windows, the chat and the Q&A. And once it's kind of stable, because they don't all come in at once, it still takes a bit of time. But we've had quite a good number of registrations for this. So and now it's fairly stable numbers, so I think we'll get started. So thanks everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Romy Beard. I'm the Head of Publisher Relations at Kronos Hub, an open access management platform, and I've been running these webinars this year to get different stakeholders in the community together to talk about various open access related topics. And today is the last webinar for the year, and it's been quite a year, so it's been quite exciting. So today we'll talk about open access and research metrics, and I've got three fantastic speakers with me here today. I've got Rod Cookson from IWA, Dominic Rosati from CITED, and Catriona McCallum von Hendawi as well. So that's as well the order for the presentation, so you won't get confused. So just a quick word on how we structure these webinars. If you haven't attended any of my webinars before, we'll have some short presentations, about 8 to 10 minutes each of the speakers, followed by a discussion. Afterwards, if you have any questions during the presentations, I will bring them into the conversation at some point, perhaps during the discussion. So please put them in the chat or the Q&A. Also, our speakers might answer if it's a very specific question. They can see the Q&A, so they might answer it after their presentation, and then it's already answered. So please feel free to engage and ask your questions. And we're recording the webinar as well, so if you're not able to attend all of it, or you have problems, or perhaps you're joining us later to watch the recording, we'll be sharing that shortly afterwards. So our topic today is open access and research metrics. So I do just a very quick introductions and what do we want to talk about today. So research metrics refers to metrics, journal metrics, as well as article and researcher level metrics to assess value. And I think today we'll mostly talk about article and journal metrics, although we'll touch on some of the other metrics as well. And I've listed here some of the most common metrics and journal metrics level, things like acceptance rate, number of submissions, number of publications. Then we have things like usage metrics, citation metrics. We'll talk, obviously, Dom will talk a lot specifically about citation metrics. And then we also have things like speed metrics. So those are some of the metrics that might come up in the webinar. And some of the questions I've asked our speakers in advance that might help frame the webinar today is, how do these metrics perform in relation to open access? Can we say that open access content is cited more widely? Does it cite more widely? Dom will have some exciting metrics to share about that. They would dig a little bit into things like impact factor as well. But overall, what we really want to talk about is what are useful metrics and for whom in an open access context, for which stakeholders, for publishers, for authors, for funders, perhaps. So those are the things that we'll touch on during the presentation, but also in the discussion. And with that, I will hand over to Rod.
Lovely. Thanks, Romy. Thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are. Very nice to talk to everyone. So as Romy said, I'm the Managing Director of IWA Publishing, and I'll start with a bit of background on who IWA Publishing are, just to help you understand our perspective on open access. We're a Learned Society publisher owned by a charity. We have a membership of around 10,000 researchers and practitioners worldwide. Our focus is on providing clean drinking water, safe sanitation, and flood management. So we're in a STEM subject area with a very clear health and development dimension. And we publish about 2,000 articles a year. We have subscribed to open journals and APC journals. And then you've got some headline stats about where we are at the moment. We publish 15 journals. They are all open access in different flavors of open access. We got 5 million downloads for those journals last year. And we also publish books. There are 25 of those annually. And so far, we're managing to make 83% of those open access. So we've got quite a broad perspective on open access and what we want to do with it. Really. I'm going to start by taking a little step back and asking a question about where we've got to with open access. And it's quite a simple question. We've moved a long way forward with open access. There is a huge amount of data available. There are many metrics. There's much information being collected. And for where I am, we have gone past the point where it's easy to keep track of all of the information, and we are into big data challenges. Next slide, Romy. Given that, I think we have a responsibility to ask ourselves which metrics can usefully be used to guide open access publishers. There are initiatives like the Journal Comparison Service going on at the moment, which are bringing together very many metrics from different sources. But there really is so much information, it's too much to digest, and selectivity is I think, going to be a defining feature of the next phase of open access and open access metrics development. So to help us look at that, I have divided metrics up into 3 categories in this colorful Venn diagram. One set of those metrics relates to author appeal. So simply, why would authors want to publish in journals? Another is global impact. So this is what happens once research is published. Does it make a difference anywhere? Does it affect the real world? And the third is journal performance. You know, those are the kind of more internal looking things that publishers focus on about, are we running our journals well? Is everything going the way we expect it to? There's a question, sorry, Romy, are others seeing the slides? Yes, okay, yes, somebody isn't seeing the slides. So good, thank you everyone for answering that question.
Slides, okay.
Yeah. So I've picked out some of the metrics that apply to each of those categories, and I'm just going to touch on them lightly now. Under author appeal, it is controversial and it is disliked by many people, and with good reason. But the first metric I've got there is impact factor quartile, because that is the reality of researchers working in our field, which, as I say, is a STEM, quite an engineering field. People are assessed, they're promoted, they're given jobs based on where they publish. There really are very strict guidelines in many countries, and there is an obligation on anyone who wants to develop a career in many of the countries which we publish research that they need high impact journals. Time from submission to first decision also matters. It's a very competitive market for journals these days, and authors are very conscious of time and rapid publication. Net Promoter Score, we do survey all of our authors, successful and otherwise. We survey reviewers as well. For the successful authors, we compile a Net Promoter Score. If you're not familiar with Net Promoter Score, it's essentially asking people to say, would you recommend our product, our company, to your colleagues? And the maximum score possible is 100. The minimum score is -100. It's an indication of, is your offering working well for the group you're talking to? And then there's an equity point here, which is the percentage of editors from regions. We are increasingly hearing when we talk to authors that they do care about being published in journals where the editors look like they do, speak the same language they do, look at the world the same way they do, and they're being treated fairly. So this is something we've started tracking recently. So as I say, just a handful of the author appeal metrics, but those are some of the most important for us at IWA Publishing. Global impact, these are quite familiar measures. The number of downloads, growth in downloads, where do those downloads come from? And then the citations that result from those downloads. So really, you know, measurable things about what happens once journal articles are published. And then performance, the kind of thing that we publishers care about. Number of articles published, is that growing? We have 10 subscribed to open journals, so how are the renewals doing? You know, we're very keen that we can publish open access this year, but we also want to be able to keep doing that in perpetuity. Cost per download, you know, we're conscious that our customers have budgets to work to, and they have ways of evaluating if we are working well within their budgets. And we also have some APC journals, so we do track number of the APC articles we publish. Again, a new metric for us is looking at the number of the percentage of articles we publish which are free to publish. You know, we like the APC journals well enough. We like our S2O journals. Ideally, we wouldn't have any author charges. You know, there are issues around APCs. So we're starting to look at this with an open mind about how do we get to completely free to publish for all authors at all times. And lastly, article unit cost, which is something we look at because we want to make sure that with our portfolio and the services we provide, we are always managing to keep our costs under control, and we're not in a situation where growing our journals means we get unacceptable, unpayable bills. So that's a quick look at some metrics. I'm now going to look at those metrics with a perspective on our recent experience. We made 10 journals open access with Subscribe to Open at the beginning of 2021. And I've picked out a few metrics just to show some of the results since we did that. So the first one is Net Promoter Score. So this is one of the author metrics I talked about before. And Net Promoter Score rose between the second and third quarters of this year from 75 to 78. Just to give you some scale, as I say, the top possible score for a Net Promoter Score is 100. The lowest possible is -100. Apple is 47. Google is 11. Facebook is -21. Anything positive is good. Up in the 70s is really, really important. And this is a number we pay lots of attention to. We have a loyal base of researchers that publish with us, and we want to make sure in changing times, our open access offering and our journal offering is working well for them. So that's an author metric. This is, again, a more familiar metric. It's what happens after we converted the 10 journals to Subscribe to Open and made them open access at the start of 2021. And the graph here is showing you number of article downloads. I think if you press the next button, it'll animate the graphic for me. In the year before 2020, we had a bit fewer than 2 million downloads. When we moved to S2O, that more than doubled to over 4 million downloads. The 2022 year-to-date data is a couple of months old there. We are on track to reach about 5 million downloads. So a very, very large increase in the number of downloads that we achieve, which is very important for us as a mission-focused organization. We do want our journals to be read. We are trying to solve real-world problems through good technical research, which has real-world applications. So more readership is brilliant for us, and we don't want barriers to that readership. Romy. And because we want everyone to be reading our research, and we don't want it to be read by a subset of researchers in well-funded countries and well-funded institutions, we also pay attention to measures like this, which is the geography of where those downloads are happening. And you'll see for each of these top 10 countries here, there are 4 columns. The darkest one is 2022 year to date, and then the lighter ones are previous years. And if you look at the second country there, the USA, you'll see that in 2021 and earlier years, it was our largest source of downloads. And that has been the case really since we started publishing online. We have many subscribers in the US. It's very, very important to us. But if you look at the country next to it, which is China, you will see that when we made our 10 journals Subscribe to Open and Open Access in 2021, we had a huge increase in usage in China. There was a big increase in US article usage, but much, much bigger increase in China. And now China is our biggest source of downloads. So this is really quite a fundamental shift in our readership. Likewise, we're very pleased to see that India is getting a very, very significant number of downloads and is growing very rapidly. This chart is color-coded. So China, India are green, which is Asia. You'll see Malaysia and the Philippines are there. So this is good. We have global remit. We are an international organization. So it's very good for us to be read in Asian countries with fast-growing populations and significant problems. There are 2 countries from Europe, Germany and the UK there, so much more of our traditional researcher base and author base. And also Australia, a very important country in our research field. There's Canada to go with the USA, so 2 countries in North America, and particularly pleasing for the first time, Ethiopia is now in our top 10. So we have Africa. So almost every continent represented in the top 10. This is much more aligned with the mission of our organization, which really is using science to improve people's lives and give better outcomes to people. And a huge progression from where we were even 5 years ago. Thanks, Romy. So the last metric I'm going to talk about is what happens after downloads. We do look at citations as a sort of a more concrete form of engagement, a more concrete proof that we've done something which has been connected with and registered with by the research community. And this is the pattern of citations we had in 2020 to articles we published in 2019. So it's before Subscribe to Open happened. And a little bit over half of our citations came from the Global South. And you can see which countries there: China, US, India, Iran, similar countries to what we saw in the downloads chart. And if you press the next one, this is what the year-to-date information for 2022 looks like. We're on track to have 3 times more citations, so a huge increase in citations with open access. And really some quite interesting changes in the distribution of those citations. Almost 2/3 are coming from the Global South now, which is excellent. That's very much delivering on our mission. Many more citations from all of the advanced countries you see there, from the US, from Australia, from the UK, from Canada. But huge increases in citations from countries like China, and also countries like Turkey are featuring in this top 10 list for citations for the first time, and Brazil. So we're getting Latin America. So this is a really nice vindication that we are reaching all continents, researchers everywhere, and doing a far better job of communicating our research than was possible before we moved to open access with S2O. So why does this matter? Come back to the original place I started. We go on to the next screen. This is how I divided the world up. Elements of what STM publishers do, research publishers do. There are elements of author appeal, global impact, and journal performance. These things look very different depending on which stakeholder is looking at them. So if you can press the first button there, Romy. For researchers, it really is the author appeal metrics. You know, they have practical considerations. They do want to keep their jobs. They do want to get promoted. They do want their research to be read promptly in good outlets that they trust and read very, very widely. So they have their particular set of considerations. Funders, the second group, are much more focused on global impact. They want to see money they've invested in research actually changing the real world, doing things that really do make the world a better place and proving to them that they spent their money wisely. Libraries are a little bit of a hybrid. They care about journal performance statistics like number of downloads and more value add metrics like cost per download, and to an extent, the global impact. They are interested in what is facilitated by the money they spend. So they sit somewhere between those two on the Venn diagram. And in the middle is, oh, there we go. In the middle is publishers who have to worry about all aspects of this and need to balance all of those. The reason I've summarized the world like this is to highlight the fact that there are many, many metrics. There are many different ways of looking at open access, many ways of measuring success of open access. The relevant metrics vary depending on who is asking. And for publishers, we have an intriguing balancing act of trying to get success and good outcomes in all kinds of metrics so that all of the different stakeholders connected succeed and understand and are happy with open access. So with that thought, I will hand you over to the capable Dom. Over to you, Dom.
Hi there. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the impact of open access on citation behavior. And yeah, I work on research at Cite, and I'll say Rami. Next slide, please. So what Cite primarily is, we are the largest citation index, but what we mostly focus on is, in addition to indexing traditional citations, is we index these in-text citations. And so we look at what authors intended to do when they cite other works, when they reference works in text. So that might be they intended to mention another paper or support another paper and so on. And this in addition to many other things, gives us the ability to kind of inspect citation behavior at a more granular level. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk about how open access papers are cited in text. And what I mean particularly in text is, like I said, it's when an author is referencing another paper, you know, they're speaking about something when they cite another person. And so it's something like, these findings do not replicate previous studies, and that's a contrasting citation. But they might cite Fan et al. 2006 in this example many times. So in-text citations, unlike traditional citations, are counted many times for each paper if the publication cites the other paper many times. So that's just a bit of context on what I'm about to present. Next slide, please. So yeah, just a bit more context on our coverage. So yeah, we have over 1.8 billion traditional citations, so we're the largest citation index, but in particular, I'll be talking about these citation statements or in-text citations. And so anything I present other than some initial stuff it comes from OpenAlex. It will be based on our ingestion and indexing process. And so what we do is we work with publishers, both open and closed access. So we do have a balance of materials, but anything I present will be obviously like biased towards what our indexing process is. Next slide, please. And I'll go into this right at the end, but yeah, I know it's a bit small, but one of the main things we try to do in terms of research output assessment is when we're looking at citations, and which is the basis for many of these impact metrics. We typically just have these dumb numbers, and again, if we use citation types like number of supporting, again, we have count-based things, but the main thing we try to do is surface what's being said about publications, so you can qualitatively assess what's being said about a paper. So with that, without further ado, yes. Yeah, and then essentially we produce this giant citation graph and so on, but it's more of a visual of what we do. So next slide, please. Okay, so one thing that is happening, and I think many people have talked about this, and this is publication rates per year from OpenAlex since 1990, is many journals are becoming, sorry, I'm getting tripped up on OpenAlex having the same acronym as open access. And anyways, many people have found that, not only are publication rates rising per year, but also open access is quickly closing the gap between non-open access publications and open access publications. And next slide, please. If you look at the number of citations received by non-open access and open access papers, you see a similar closing the gap in terms of traditional citations that are received. So it's not quite where open access papers are receiving more citations than non-open access citations, but it looks like, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, go back. So I thought I had my log scale slide. It looks like it's closing going to be closing the gap. So we'll see. Next slide, please. But if you look at citation rates normalized, so this is the citation rates normalized by the number of non-open access or open access publications. Open access publications have tended to always receive more citations than non-open access, except for this little inflection point around 2018, where open access has started receiving, non-open access has started receiving more citations than open access. Next slide, please. But yes, yeah, this is where that slide went. But open access appears to be closing the gap on number of citations received. Next slide, please. So if you, one perspective to look at, if you go a little bit beyond just looking at numbers of citations received. You could look at this number of citations given by open access or non-open access. And this is quite interesting. Around 2008 or so, there was an inflection point where open access publications tend to give quite a bit more, on a order of 4 times more in 2020, thereabouts, 3 times more citations than non-open access, which is an interesting trend. Next slide, please. And so if we look at in-text citations rather than traditional citations, so this is like the number of times I cite you in my paper. I might cite you 10 times. I'm heavily engaged with your publication, or I might cite you 1 time just in passing. Those are different types of behavior. And if we look at that, actually open access is cited, if you count in-text citations, more than non-open access. And the inflection point was in 2020 when we started to see this. So it depends on kind of what you, and yeah, this was just a reminder of what in-text citations were. So indeed, if you look at traditional citations, open access isn't quite cited more. But if you look at in-text citations like these and count them, then open access publications are tended to be cited more now. And if you look at, again, in-text citations, but normalized, open access has always sort of been more engaged with, so to speak. Next slide, please. And again, just to go back to why perhaps open access might be giving more citations. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide again. Why open access might be giving more citations, you can sort of look at a breakdown between like, does open access give more citations to open access or non-open access? And you can see like the majority of citations that are given by open access, and mostly it's open access to open access papers nowadays, after about 2015 or 16. So before we were dominated by non-open access papers citing non-open access papers, but now by far the majority of citations that are given are from open access papers to open access papers. And there's many things to like try to think about why that is, why open access papers might be one of the things, and we might get into this in discussion, that we sort of thought about is potentially open access having less editorial restrictions. So, they might have more freedom to cite more papers or more broadly, and so on. So I'm going to go in a little bit more about granular citation behavior. So this is what a supporting citation is when I talk about it. These conclusions are consistent with previous studies and so on. Next slide, please. So if we look at which open access versus non-open access articles receive more supporting citations, it actually just tends to reflect the behavior we've seen with citation behavior in general, which is open access publications receiving more citations in general at some inflection point. So actually, so open access articles started to receive more supporting citations a few years before open access started receiving more citations in general. Next slide, please. And if we look at contrasting citations, which are these things like these findings do not replicate previous studies and so on. Next slide, please. We see that, again, it's a very similar inflection point where open access papers started receiving more criticism earlier on than citations in general. And this is sort of the trend of critical citations received over time. Next slide, please. And in terms of who gives more supporting citations or who gives more contrasting citations, it's like generally the same trend of open access giving much more supporting or much more contrasting citation. Next slide, please. You can see the contrasting, so much more contrasting citations. Next slide, please. And there's many additional questions about why that is, why open access might be giving more citations in general, why more supporting, why more contrasting, even though it sort of follows the trend of just having more citations. These are all big open questions. But one thing I just wanted to emphasize is that even though these kinds of metrics are interesting, I think aiding qualitative assessment of literature is probably even more interesting than having these aggregate metrics to see citation behavior over time. So where you can read differences in how authors have talked about open access or non-open access papers. And that's not something like we've gone into too much in detail, but I think it is an interesting sort of open question of, do people, when they speak about another paper, if they're citing an open access versus non-open access paper, is there a difference? Is there more engagement and those kinds of things, which I think is kind of borne out in the numbers that I presented. And that's about it. I'm happy to hand it off to Katrina.
Thanks so much, Tom. Over to you, Katrina.
Oh, hi. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak. So if you can just move on to the next slide. So just very briefly, Hindawi, we've been fully open access since 2007, publish about 30,000 articles, and they're all very liberally licensed, CC BY, or even more liberal than that, public domain. And one of the sort of missions for Hindawi was to take, and this was written by the CEO in 2017, a radically open approach to developing infrastructure for open science. So this centered on open metadata, open contracts, open data, open access, and it was really with that spirit that Hindawi has become a global publisher. Of course, we've recently been acquired by Wiley in 2021. One of the things we do is we operate all our journals, all the Hindawi journals, and in fact, a lot of the Wiley journals are now coming over to, we have an open source platform, which is essentially from submission to publication, which helps to, and is specifically made for publishing open access articles and being able to provide that sort of high quality open metadata to cross-ref. And that's one of the aspects of the company. So the next slide, please. My role at Hindawi, I'm Director of Open Science, and we're trying to drive that approach across everything we do. And I mean, we've all heard of open science recently, and it's perhaps best encapsulated by the recent recommendations from UNESCO, which really captures the spirit and intentions of open science. And open access is a great thing, but open access is just the sort of first step, I think, towards open science. And again, in relation to metrics and discoverability, if you put something free on the web, but it doesn't have the metadata, it can't be discovered, it's not being able to be accessed by others. And equally, you don't have authors, editors, and reviewers from all over the world able to contribute their work, then really there's real limitations to open access. And so I think that there is a movement across funders, especially institutions, and increasingly publishers, to move towards open science. Next slide, please. And part of that is, as I've said, it's not just about open outputs like articles, data, preprints, peer review reports, or whatever. It's open infrastructure, but it all depends on culture change. So you can have as much openness as you like, but essentially the reward system, and it's often driven by metrics, if you can't actually change the way researchers collaborate, share, and publishers information, then we're not going to see the benefits of that. So next slide, please. So where do metrics come in? One of the things alongside the move towards open science is the whole movement towards responsible metrics and trying to move away from the impact factor. And these are just some very well-known initiatives. They're increasingly getting attention. DORA is now a really global initiative that provides resources. And the rationale for this, and unfortunately, it's why, as Rod said, authors still want to just know their impact factor, which is a real problem. And it also is a real problem because impact factors actually drive submission to publishers, which then drives revenue streams to publishers, and institutions use them in rankings, which drive better researchers to institutions. So there's an entirely horrible negative feedback loop where the reputational and career moves of researchers actually tied in with financial gain of publishers and of institutions. And breaking this is the only way that we're going to actually see a move to open science. A couple of examples of this. This was one of the most egregious cases I've seen. Yeah, next slide. Thanks, Romy, of using the impact factor. And this was a large health department at a European university, which I won't name, and they have this formula with the impact factor in it. I'm not going to go through it, but the fact that it's called analysis of absolute worth, and this wasn't very long ago. This is in the past 4 years. This was. It just shows you what a long way we've got to go if this is how people are judging researchers. And likewise, citations are useful. Next slide, please. And it's fantastic the work Dom's doing. It's really interesting to see that context and the nuances around citations. But again, we're dealing with inherent biases in the system. This isn't actually an old paper, but it was a paper about, and it's one paper that supported a particular hypothesis. It's about Alzheimer's, essentially. And it fed into a grant application, and essentially all these blue dotted other papers cited it positively, and they used it to support grant applications. What was really interesting is that no one cited, or very few people cited, the very few negative studies, including the negative study by the same authors who published the first positive study. And even those authors were less inclined and didn't cite their own stuff. And again, there's this feedback loop that isn't necessarily catching where null or negative results are not valued as much as positive results, and they can feed biases into the system. So next slide, please. What I'm going to do is just to talk about metrics in a slightly different way, and the role of being much more transparent about journals, because essentially if we're to get rid of this culture, then publishers themselves have a responsibility to showcase other publishing services and features that actually provide a different set of choices for authors and institutions and their funders. Everyone looks at the impact factor and just assumes that impact factor is quality, high quality journal, providing the services you want, and therefore it's all nicely packaged and you don't need anything else. And this is really also about creating trust in scholarly publishing, uncovering those services that that publishers do. And one case, an example, is in terms of predatory publishing. Now, predatory publishing at one level relies on the fact that peer review doesn't operate properly. Transparent peer review, making those peer review reports openly available, would probably stop transparent predatory publishing in its tracks. There's things like this. But I'm going to give you an example, and this started, it tells a little bit of story, because we started collaborating with the Researcher and Research Institute during COVID, and they were very interested to see what impact publishers have had in response to the Wellcome Trust statement that COVID articles should be pre-printed, data should be shared, they needed to be got through fast on the system. And there's a lot to that, and I've put a couple of links there. But essentially, we collaborated with a group of publishers and others to share data, and it came out with this report. Now, only 4 of the publishers, the next slide, please, actually shared data on rejected papers. Now, that's something that publishers don't do, because what if it makes you look bad? And yet, at the same time, most many journals have huge numbers of rejection rates. And so eLife, along with 3 other publishers, chose to share data on rejected papers. And it actually shows that we were rejecting more COVID papers than non-COVID papers on average, and at a faster rate. Now, in some ways, this was a hidden service. There was a huge volume of COVID papers coming in, and journals were getting rid of a lot of stuff that shouldn't have been published faster and more often. Now, there's a discussion to be had around that, but actually what we did by working with independent researchers, if you go on to the next slide, please, is that you gain insights into your journals, insights into different aspects of the services that you wouldn't have otherwise. And it's all very well publishers analyzing their own data, but you actually need independent scrutiny and the research skills that brings to sort of give that sense of trust, and that it's not just being spun by the things. If we just go back to that previous slide, and essentially by sharing data that you wouldn't normally share, you learn a huge amount, including the fact that you can share data. It is scary, but you can share it. But you benefit a huge amount about insights into your services and open science into other publishers. And these sorts of things are not being surfaced and made apparent to others. And next slide, please. So partly, again, working with Rory, we're also at the same time, and this is the Journal Comparison Service. And I think there's a lot of criticisms of the Journal Comparison Service. People don't know if it's going to be used. It's only available to institutions. It's not a great platform, all of this type of things. But the exercise of doing this for a publisher means that you have to start to get your data and manage in such a way to provide in a way that's never been asked for before, and to give a price breakdown for what might be different services. And just thinking about that is actually a really useful exercise for publishers to do. Now, you know, how much you put into sales or marketing, how much of the cost of an APC goes into peer review, all of these things, and it's not perfect. I wrote a blog post about this. But at the same time, for us, it made us really focus. We had to get data on more than 200 journals, centralize it, standardize it. There are things like time to first decision. There isn't even a consistent standard among publishers about what first decision means, even within publishers when you've got huge platforms, and then time in medium peer review and this sort of is just beginning. But these sorts of data should be available for everyone, authors included, to say, well, you know, what is the median number of reviews per accepted article, and that sort of information. It provides information about the integrity of the process. And we actually use that data, the next slide, please, to create new journal reports, basing a lot of that data from the Journal Comparison Service, but adding it. So for any Hindawi journal, you can go and, except for there are some criteria, but for most Hindawi journals, you can go to and see this full report. Next slide. And this was done by Alessandra. This work was done by Alessandra Odino, who was an intern for us, now working on this. And we give the usual metrics around how many submissions, publications, downloads, impact factors, but we've also got top 5 countries by readership. Next slide. And we also, again, trying to look at the sort of issues of equity. Where are authors coming from? Where are editors coming from? Where are reviewers coming from? And this is for one of our largest journals, but also those times to first decision, that rejection rate before peer review. How often do you see that from publishers? This sort of information, just exposing it, people can go and see it for all our journals. And next slide, please. We also wanted to start to talk about the metadata and the infrastructure. So how much of our content is open access? Well, 100%. So not all publishers can say that. This actually comes from a Crossref. We take it from the Crossref API, but also how many licenses are readable by a human machine, how many references. We were a part of the initiative for open citations, got 100% of our references available, and almost 100% of our abstracts available. We're also part of the initiative for open abstracts, and some articles don't have abstracts, which is why it's less than 100%. And we've got 100% corresponding authors with ORCID. Now, what this means is that these articles are actually more discoverable. They're linked to people. And you can start to see how you can also, this is just the first phase of the journal reports, but you could start to add things around data availability, linking to how many data sets are connected. Next slide, please. We're also, in our next release, going to introduce journal citation distributions for each of the journal. You can read about that here, but this is basically saying, if you look at the GIF, you don't get an accurate representation of the spread of articles. Some articles are being cited way more, even if it's a journal with a low impact factor. Now, those articles are not getting the traditional credit that, you know, if it was an impact factor of 20, you'd think that that article was much better, but some articles are getting citations of 20. And this is the same for many, and making that apparent and showing that the GIF is really statistically irrelevant as a metric with which to look at any researcher is part of this. So the next slide, please. And again, this is really about open science. So open science has a whole load of different outputs, including publications, but also preprints, data, peer review reports, whatever. And our customers now as publishers are not just readers as they were and subscribers in the old day, and they're not just authors now. They're anyone, they're governments and institutions and libraries and funders who pay for footing the bill for the research and research communication. They're researchers, academies, societies who create and validate that knowledge. And then there's all the people that use and reuse that knowledge, which is why the infrastructure and being able to connect the work between people, funders, organizations to their data is really important. And the question now for publishers is when you're thinking about metrics, what are you trying, what is the service that you're trying to provide for this community of users, readers, authors? And then how best do you demonstrate that and how best do you serve them in an open science world? So I think we need to sort of go back to the drawing board of metrics. And what's nice is that there is this plethora now coming out and there is exploration and experimentation about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And I know we've got some questions already, and I've got a number of questions. I just wanted to share this one slide on ConOSUP and the metrics that we share with authors post-publication, but also in the journal finder, like what information do authors find useful before they make a decision on where to publish, and in what format do they want to see that information, and at which point do they want to compare. And there's something that we've discussed is, you know, do authors want to compare journals side by side to see, well, this journal I can get published in quicker, but this other journal, it might be cheaper to publish in or might be eligible for an APC, like this mixture of metrics. And maybe that's a good point to just start discussion just around the author use case, and if anyone has any experiences they want to share with regards to that, of what your authors are looking for. Katrina, I don't know if you've done any analysis on which part of the website people are looking at, what metrics authors on the journal pages find most useful.
So that's something we've only introduced the journal reports recently, and we've got some analysis. One is really interesting, that it's affecting what's called the submission journey of authors. And it's very preliminary data, but basically it looks as though it's having a positive impact on submissions to authors. But we're also, we haven't yet done it, we're going to tag exactly down the reports. So try and pick up where authors are going to. So, you know, when we got feedback from some editors and reviewers, anecdotal, the main thing was put the impact factor at the top, which we haven't done. Or they didn't like some of the maps. What was very interesting is that they didn't want necessarily to show where authors or reviewers were coming from, which is, again, there's a real question mark there. We put the discovery section about Crossref down the bottom because you know, it's about raising awareness. I don't think researchers think about the infrastructure and the metadata. It'd be really interesting to see if anyone gets down to the bottom of the page. Anyway, how do you raise awareness about these sorts of things?
And there's so many different metrics as well, because it's what metrics do I want to see after I've been published? Where's my article being read? Like usage statistics, not just citations, but then also beforehand at the different stages.
That's right. That's right.
And perhaps I'll start off with my question for Rod, in terms of when we think about who is using the metrics and for what, in what context. I wanted to ask you, what metrics did you specifically look at when you made your decision to move to subscribe to Open? Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, Remy. Thanks for that question. I guess I'll start by saying that we did flip one subscription journal to open access on an APC model in 2020. So that journal was Hydrology Research. And there were things we liked about that flip, and there were things we didn't like. We very much liked the increase in usage and the expansion of where the journal was being read. And I think generally there was a positive response from authors. What we didn't like was how the amount of revenue for the journal, certainly in the short term, roughly halved, which we anticipated. And our expectation and hope is that over a period of time, that returns to previous levels. And, you know, economically it works out well. But we realized, having done that experiment and having a very clear desire to move our journals to open access, that we simply couldn't afford to do the same approach for the other journals. So what we liked about S2O is it's allowed us to keep those things that we like about the open access flip for hydrology research, the very large increase in downloads that we saw in the data I showed before, the much wider distribution, the increase in citations that drives, but do it in a way that is economically sustainable for us. So it's a transition. There's an awful lot of learning to do, but you know, it's an achievable thing for a publisher to do, and I think we feel happy having done that. That we have some of those metrics I talked about, some of the author satisfaction metrics. We look quite carefully at, you know, library metrics, and we're keen to make sure libraries have good data and that they're seeing, you know, good cost per download figures. And generally, we're getting a convergence of, you know, sort of very positive metrics around S2O, which makes us like the model more than we did at the beginning.
And we've got a question here from Lisa Hinchcliffe as well about how, if you already know this, how revenues are shifting country-wise with the move from paywall to open. And perhaps the question is also if there was a metric for that. I don't know what that would be called.
I mean, it's a good question, Lisa. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, the immediate things we've been doing, metrics-wise, is we've been looking at some of the tactical questions. You know, sort of, you know, are we giving good value to libraries? Is the proposition good? Does it work well from the library perspective? I think we're also interested to look at who is using our journals significantly and not contributing. You know, and we're very happy to talk to those people. We have once or twice looked at those kind of, you know, geographic profiles, and, you know, what we would expect to see over a long-ish period of time, you know, a number of years, is a steady shift away from our historic core of supporters, of subscribers in North America and Europe, more towards Asia. And to an extent that happens. And we're tracking that, we're interested in that, and we'd like to see, you know, our journals very widely used and very widely supported. In terms of, is there a metric for measuring that, which is actually your question, there's nothing I can offer at this point. I am interested in the question, as clearly you are, Lisa. So I will keep thinking about this. You know, we do have sort of visualization tools on our journal dashboards that let us see how, you know, many aspects of journals change geographically over time. You know, so the things like downloads and submissions and articles published, revenue as well. And we do look at those, but we don't have a good metric. We'd like a good metric. So if you find one, please do let me know as well.
Thanks, Rod. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is context around metrics. And I think that's where a lot of things perhaps went wrong with the journal impact factor, because people looked at how research is being communicated and suddenly that's become a number to decide whether it's valuable to read or not, which isn't exactly the same thing. And there was a very interesting talk at the Charleston conference by Daniel Hook from Digital Science on the psychology of metrics, on how as humans we really, you know, like to read numbers and kind of order things. And if you don't know what impact factor is, if you have 3 journals, you will pick the one with the highest number just because you're naturally inclined to do that. But it is really important to put every metric into some kind of context. And during our prep call, we were digging a little bit into what Dom was sharing and how OA content cites more than non-OA content. Please correct me if I got this wrong now, Dom. And we were discussing a little bit what the reasons are behind that. Can you talk a little bit about what you think might be the reasons of for the OA citing more than non-OA content?
Yeah, I mean, you do have it right. And I think it's tricky to say without investigating it in detail. And we also came up with maybe a good potential study, which is you could look at these numbers over time and see what happens when journals flip to open access, or if, you know, giving citations remain stable over time per publisher, per journal, and so on. But I think, I think the one thing that I have seen doing, like, because we work with bibliometrics researchers providing data and so on for different kinds of research output assessment and so on. And I think there is this difference between, and I mentioned it maybe too briefly, but there's this difference between engagement and simply citing someone. So, you know, there's a difference in citation behavior when you just cite somebody in passing, or you cite that article because it's conventional to cite it, or you have to cite it, and so on, versus like you've read something and it's really important to your study, you know, it's the basis for your methodology, or you know, you're replicating it, and so on. So you're heavily engaging with it, and you tend to cite it more in text. And I think I would probably speculate, like, and again, just to emphasize, it's speculation, right? And this is based on just our experience with working with bibliometricians, is that there's probably this thing happening where if an article is open access, it's more likely that it's engaged with heavily, because as many people know, you can cite something if you just read the title or the abstract and you think it's important. But if you don't have access to that paper, right, you can't really look at the full text or read it, and you can't engage with it, and so on. So yeah, I would say, like, open access papers are probably citing more, because it's not only are the authors choosing to publish in open access journals, but they're having access to open access journals that they want to engage with. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's all kinds of reasons you could come up with for why open access publications cite others, but I think it's probably this, like,
Katrina, you were talking a little bit about editorial practice as well, weren't you?
Yes, the editorial practice, just in terms of there used to be such strict page limits and things with subscription journals, print distribution, and whether there's just, and I think, Dom, you mentioned there's more leniency in that, or even just how many citations you're allowed to cite in an article. So some journals have a restriction just on the number of references you can have in a paper, which in some ways, you know, editorially might make sense, but it also doesn't make sense. But also, you know, there are ways, if you have numbered citations in the text, you can put in more citations in the text than if you spell out, you know, Smith, Jones, and whatever. So there's different things that may bias it. And also, in terms of the study, we're thinking about actually looking at hybrid journals, where you've got some articles in the same journal that are open access, some that aren't, to see compare the citation. But again, there's loads of confounding variables. Really interesting area.
I think there's some interesting aspects to dig in and maybe put the two together, like look at just the numbers, but then also look behind and say, what do the numbers tell us? Is that actually, are there other stories to tell? I know we're coming up to the end of the hour, so I just wanted to give each of you a chance to have another quick 10 seconds where you want to share some key takeaways or key points around OA metrics with our audience. Do you want to go first, Dom?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it's just a recap of what I said, where I think it's like you say, we just need to provide more context to these metrics, and well, actually, maybe one thing that is potentially interesting about open access that isn't with closed access is, I mean, it's obvious, but like people who are doing research, bibliometrics research, to give these things context and come up with indicators or come up with context for indicators or criticism, if something's open access, you have access to the full text by definition. So you can do these more sophisticated, like natural language processing things. So it just provides these more opportunities for doing more advanced research, which I would be a heavy advocate. So if anybody wanted to connect with me and is interested in doing that kind of research, we would love to collaborate.
Thanks, Dom. Katrina?
So I think there's two things. Any metric will be gained, and we have to be really careful about using any quantitative metric and assigning one better than another. We're going to need a diversity of metrics and different contents, and qualitative as well as quantitative. And then the other thing, I think, from a sort of publishing perspective, is what is it that we want from journals or publishers in this sort of new open science world, and how best should they display those things? What are the services that institutions and funders and authors should be interested in at a level? Let's get away from the impact factor. And then are publishers actually stacking up and showing, can you compare the peer review services of one or more publishers? What does speed mean versus discovery? All of these sorts of things.
Thanks, Katrina. Over to you, Rod, for last words.
Thanks, Romy. I was going to say three things. First, there are many open access metrics, as we've discussed. I think it's important that we focus on a small subset of those that are meaningful for key stakeholders, and spend much less time thinking about the others. So let's be focused, let's be disciplined, and let's work out what the useful metrics are. I'd ask a question. How do we measure equity? I think that's a very important part of the evolution of open access, and there isn't a good answer out there at the moment. I know Robin Sin is in the audience for this webinar, and we're working on something called the Library Partnership, which is an attempt to bring a lot of equity related questions together and start putting together ways of measuring them and trying to understand, is a publisher equitable, and providing open access services in a good and constructive way. And the last thing I'd say is, in the next 5 years, I would look ahead, and I would hope that we'll have clear metrics demonstrating value for money for libraries and their support of open access, demonstrating equity so that the community generally is getting served well and is being served fairly, demonstrating for researchers that they get visibility for their research, and they get engagement from their research, and for funders that what they fund creates impact. I think the only way that's going to happen is if we work together. And if we do so, I think we can ensure that socially responsible open access, rather than commercially driven open access, becomes the norm. And I think that's a good thing to work towards. That's my parting thought to everyone. And thank you everyone
so
for
much.
participating in this.
Yeah, thank you so much to all our speakers. It's been really great having you. I feel like this is a big topic, and we only scratched the surface, and you could dig into like more specific use cases for each of these, but hopefully it sparked some thinking and some discussion. Just in closing, I want you to encourage to join our newsletter and events list if you want to be up to date with any other events we've got coming up. We've got a publisher workshop at the end of January, and running some researcher educational webinars on like very basic on what is OA, what are the different journal types that you have, what are the different things that are involved with APCs and funder requirements. And I'm also working on the kind of panel discussion type webinars for the start of next year. So there'll be some dates popping up soon. So thank you so much. Please feel free to get in touch, and I'll put you in touch with any of the speakers if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Romy. Thanks, Chronosub.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.